Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
That night, everything came crashing down around me in a way that felt both inevitable and utterly shocking. As if the universe had decided to test just how much one woman in her mid-40s from the heartland could endure before she either broke or found a hidden strength buried deep within the layers of her carefully constructed life. And as I stood there in the dim light of my suburban kitchen watching my husband of 18 years pack his bags without so much as a backward glance, I realized that my silence about the private equity fund I had quietly built over nearly a decade and the secluded mountain cabin tucked away in a family trust under my control might have been the biggest mistake or perhaps the smartest move I ever made. Because in that moment of profound betrayal layered with my father's harsh rejection echoing in my ears from a phone call just hours earlier, I began to sense that the path ahead would lead to a reckoning they would all come to regret in ways that twisted my gut with a mix of vindication and sorrow long before the dust even settled. It started on a Tuesday evening in late October, when the autumn air carried that crisp bite through the streets of our quiet Ohio neighborhood. The kind of weather that usually made me look forward to curling up with a hot cider and Mark's arm around me after a long day at the bank. But instead I found myself gripping the steering wheel of my sensible sedan as I drove home from what turned out to be the last meeting of my career there, my boss's voice still ringing in my head with its detached efficiency as he explained the downsizing decision over a video call that afternoon. His face pixelated on my screen while he outlined how corporate restructuring demanded sacrifices from mid-level managers like me who had spent 20 years climbing the ladder through endless reports on loan portfolios and client risk assessments, without ever letting on about the parallel world I inhabited, where my own investment fund was quietly amassing returns from savvy bets on emerging green tech companies that no one in my personal life suspected existed. I didn't argue or plead during that call, didn't mention how the fund had already generated enough passive income to sustain me comfortably for years if I chose to tap it. Nor did I bring up the cabin in the Colorado Rockies that served as my secret retreat funded through the trust my mother had meticulously established before her passing to shield assets from my father's impulsive tendencies, because revealing any of that would have shattered the facade of the dependable wife and daughter everyone expected me to be, and in the fragile economy gripping the Midwest, where factories shuttered and families tightened belts, admitting to such hidden security might have painted me as ungrateful or worse, a fraud who hadn't earned her place through sheer grit alone. Pulling into the driveway of our split-level home with its faded siding and the basketball hoop still hanging crooked from better days when our son was young and the marriage felt solid, I carried the cardboard box of my desk belongings under one arm, feeling the weight of it symbolize far more than just a few framed photos and a stapler, and as I pushed open the front door the familiar scent of our lived-in space greeted me with an undercurrent of something off, like the air held secrets it couldn't quite contain any longer. Voices drifted from the living room, Mark's low rumble mixed with a softer feminine tone that sent a chill racing up my spine before I even rounded the corner, and there they were on our worn couch where we had shared countless movie nights, his hand resting casually on her knee as if this intrusion into our life was the most natural thing in the world, Jenna from his sales team at the auto parts distributor looking up with wide eyes that quickly narrowed into feigned surprise while Mark stammered an excuse about discussing work deadlines that neither of us believed for a second. She gathered her coat and purse with hurried movements, murmuring apologies that fell flat in the tense silence as she brushed past me on her way out, her perfume lingering like an accusation. And once the door clicked shut behind her, Mark turned to me with that practiced calm he reserved for difficult clients, admitting over the remnants of a half-eaten dinner that the marriage had been fraying for months due to the stresses of our jobs and the monotony of routine, that Jenna understood his ambitions in a way I apparently no longer did, and as he methodically folded clothes into a duffel bag upstairs, I sat at the kitchen table nursing a glass of water that did nothing to quench the dryness in my throat, choosing silence over the explosion of questions that bubbled inside, because what good would it do to reveal the financial empire I had built in secrecy, the fund that could have bought back our happiness or at least given me leverage in this unraveling, or to mention the cabin where I had escaped alone on weekends to plot my next moves away from the noise of family expectations. The sting deepened the following morning when I dialed my father in his ranch-style house just outside Akron, the same place where I had grown up amid the clamor of his factory shifts and his booming voice laying down rules that brooked no argument. Seeking the solace of familial support in this double blow of job loss and marital collapse, only to hear his gruff response crackle over the line after I laid out the bare facts without embellishment, his words cutting sharper than any layoff. Notice as he declared that they didn't want me there burdening the household with my problems, since I was a grown woman who should have her act together by now, the they. Referring to my stepmother, who had entered our lives a decade after Mom's death and never quite embraced me as her own. Her influence turning what was once a straightforward father-daughter bond into something laced with unspoken resentments over inheritances and old wounds. Hanging up left me hollow, tears tracing paths down my cheeks as I wandered the empty house gathering what few essentials I could fit into a suitcase, the reality settling in that my pride, or perhaps my fear of vulnerability, had kept me from sharing the truths that might have changed their minds. The fund's steady growth from initial investments in solar startups to diversified portfolios yielding dividends that mocked my current penniless facade, and the cabin's deed secured in the trust with its panoramic views of pine-covered peaks offering a sanctuary I had visited sparingly to maintain the illusion of simplicity back home. In the quiet aftermath as I loaded my car and locked the door on the life I had known, an unopened envelope caught my eye on the counter amid the mail pile, postmarked from years ago in my mother's elegant script. And sliding it open revealed a single note tucked inside that sent a fresh wave of intrigue through my grief. Her words warning that the cabin awaited when I was ready, but to guard against family secrets. That could wound deeper than any external betrayal, leaving me to wonder as I drove toward an uncertain horizon what hidden layers in my own lineage might now surface to either save me or drag me further into the abyss, just as my phone began to vibrate with an unknown caller on the dashboard. The screen lighting up with possibilities that could either unravel everything or forge a path to the revenge simmering unspoken in my chest. That wrong number call from the telemarketer hawking car warranties turned out to be a bizarre mercy in disguise as it snapped me out of the fog long enough to throw my suitcase into the trunk and point the car toward the interstate without a clear destination in mind, other than away from the suffocating echoes of rejection that seemed to follow me like a bad debt collector, leading me eventually to a rundown motel just off the highway in a nondescript town where the neon vacancy sign buzzed intermittently against the darkening sky, and the parking lot held a scattering of rigs from truckers who probably had their own tales of roads not taken. The kind of place where anonymity came cheap at $20 a night, including a threadbare towel and a coffee maker that spat out something resembling sludge, but at least provided a temporary barrier against the world that had just kicked me to the curb without so much as a goodbye pat on the back. Settling into the room with its peeling wallpaper patterned in faded florals that reminded me of my grandmother's outdated curtains and the faint hum of the ancient air conditioner battling the late fall chill seeping through the window, I unpacked only the essentials like a change of clothes and my laptop, which served as the portal to the private equity fund's dashboard where green arrows pointed upward on investments in wind farms across the plains and biotech firms promising breakthroughs in affordable healthcare, assets that could have rewritten my narrative in an instant if I had chosen to leverage them during the fallout with Mark or my father, but instead, I kept them locked away like a guilty secret born from years of proving myself through visible struggles rather than the invisible triumphs that might have made everyone question whether I deserved their pity or their scorn. As the first night stretched into a restless vigil broken only by the occasional wail of a semi braking on the ramp outside, my thoughts drifted back to the marriage with Mark in a haze of hindsight that carried a wry edge of humor even as it twisted the knife deeper. Recalling how we had met at a company picnic 15 years earlier when he charmed me with stories of his sales conquests over lukewarm hot dogs and potato salad under a sky-threatening rain much like the one now pattering against the motel's thin roof. And how over time the spark had dimmed into a routine of shared complaints about work deadlines and grocery budgets without ever delving into the separate orbits we had carved for ourselves, where I managed high-stakes deals under a pseudonym to avoid the spotlight that could complicate our middle-class facade while he chased commissions that never quite matched his boasts, leading to those subtle resentments that built like interest on an unpaid loan until Jenna entered. The picture as the shiny distraction promising excitement, without the baggage of mortgages and family holidays that had long since lost their luster. Lying there on the lumpy mattress that sagged under my weight like it mirrored the exhaustion in my bones, I couldn't help but let out a quiet chuckle at the absurdity of it all. Picturing Mark fumbling through his explanations to friends about the split as if trading a reliable sedan for a flashy sports car that might leave you stranded on the shoulder. And in a moment of impulsive curiosity fueled by the isolation, I decided to probe the waters of his remorse by firing off a text message from my phone, pretending to be the bigger person in this mess. Something innocuous about having tucked away a few $100s in our joint account for any emergencies that might arise during the transition, because even now part of me wondered if the man I had built a life with retained enough decency to feel the sting of his choices, or if he had already rewritten our history to suit his new chapter with someone who probably ironed his shirts without complaint. The response came faster than expected. His words flashing on the screen with a casual thanks that carried no hint of the desperation I half hoped for, followed by a brief update on how he and Jenna were settling into a rental apartment downtown where the commute to work felt invigorating rather than draining. But then came the curveball that hit like a sudden market dip when he mentioned in passing that my father had reached out to him directly about a health issue brewing for weeks that the old man had kept under wraps for me out of some misguided sense of not wanting to add to my burdens, describing it as a heart irregularity flagged during a routine checkup at the local clinic that now demanded specialist consultations and possibly invasive procedures in a medical system stretched thin by waitlists and insurance loopholes that hit hardest in Rust Belt towns like ours, where blue-collar retirees like Dad stretched pensions to cover rising premiums. This revelation twisted something inside me because it directly implicated the family trust tied to the mountain cabin, which held enough equity from Mom's prudent real estate maneuvers before her illness to cover such expenses multiple times over if I authorized the drawdown through the anonymous channels set up to protect the assets from exactly the kind of familial meddling that had always loomed large. Yet intervening now meant dipping into that hidden reservoir prematurely and risking the exposure of my control over it all to a father who had just days ago dismissed me as an unwelcome complication in his orderly existence, forcing me to wrestle with the dilemma of whether extending this lifeline from the shadows would affirm my lingering loyalty to the man who raised me amid the clang of assembly lines and stern lectures on self-reliance, or if it would simply feed into the pattern of silence that had allowed everyone to underestimate me to the point where their regrets might one day taste as bitter as the motel's instant coffee brewing in the corner. Days melted into a monotonous rhythm of scrolling job boards on sites that promised opportunities in finance, consulting, or remote analysis roles that paled in comparison to the autonomy of my fund's operations, where I monitored quarterly reports from venture-backed firms innovating in electric vehicle batteries and sustainable agriculture tech that aligned with the environmental shifts sweeping through American heartlands, from California co-ops to Midwest farms adapting to climate pressures, all while resisting the urge to accelerate withdrawals that could fund a more dignified interim, like a short-term lease on a cozy apartment instead of this transient limbo that chipped away at my resolve with every flickering fluorescent light in the hallway. One afternoon, as I stepped out for a walk along the motel's overgrown perimeter trail that overlooked a stretch of empty fields dotted with rusted silos evoking the faded glory of agricultural booms past, my phone vibrated with a call from the lawyer overseeing the fund's legal structure, a sharp-suited professional in Chicago whom I had met only twice in person, but trusted implicitly with the veil of secrecy that shielded my identity from prying eyes in both professional and personal spheres. His voice urgent over the line as he detailed irregularities in recent transaction logs, suggesting that an unauthorized party had accessed peripheral records, perhaps probing for weaknesses in the portfolio's diversification strategy that included stakes in real estate developments mirroring the cabin's value appreciation over the years. This intrusion hit too close to home, igniting a cascade of suspicions about who might be behind it, whether a former colleague from the bank nursing grudges over my quiet competence, or even someone within my fractured family circle leveraging connections to unearth the financial independence I had cultivated as a bulwark against exactly these vulnerabilities, and as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the barren landscape that seemed to echo the uncertainties multiplying in my life, I pocketed the phone with a resolve hardening like frost on the ground, knowing that pursuing this lead would demand steps out of the careful obscurity I had maintained for so long, potentially colliding with the personal vendettas already simmering from Mark's betrayal and Dad's rejection in ways that could either illuminate a path to reclamation or plunge me deeper into a web of conflicts where the line between protector and prey blurred into oblivion, just as another call notification lit up the screen, this time from a number I recognized all too well. That second call turning out to be from an old client of the fund whom I had to politely deflect with vague assurances about portfolio performance without revealing my current upheavals, only amplified the unease stirred by the lawyer's earlier warning about those probing transaction logs that hinted at someone circling my financial fortress like a hawk eyeing a vulnerable nest in the vast American investment landscape, where privacy came at a premium and breaches could unravel years of meticulous planning, from seed capital in niche solar panel manufacturers to scaled-up holdings in data centers powering the AI boom sweeping through Silicon Valley and beyond, prompting me to finally act on the impulse that had been nagging since the motel check-in by authorizing a modest withdrawal from the fund's liquid assets, just enough to upgrade my circumstances from the dingy confines of that highway pit stop to a modest extended stay suite in a nearby chain hotel where the rooms boasted actual kitchenettes stocked with fresh linens and a view of rolling hills that evoked the serene expanses around my hidden Colorado cabin rather than the industrial grit that had started to feel like a metaphor for the underestimation I had endured from those closest to me, who saw only the laid-off banker scrambling for scraps instead of the architect of a seven-figure enterprise built on shrewd foresight into market shifts like the green energy incentives rolling out under federal policies aimed at countering climate skepticism in red state strongholds. Checking into this new space with its clean lines and the faint scent of lemon polish felt like a small act of defiance against the narrative of defeat that Mark and my father had hastily scripted for me in their rejections, allowing me to spread out my laptop on a proper desk and review the fund's latest quarterly projections, which showed steady gains from diversified bets on electric grid modernizations in the Midwest utilities sector that mirrored the very economic pressures displacing workers like my former self. And as I sipped a decent cup of tea brewed from the in-room supplies rather than the motel's bitter brew, I allowed myself a moment of wry amusement at the irony of it all, picturing how those who had cast me aside would react if they knew their dismissals were funding my quiet resurgence in a way that positioned me to observe their unraveling from a perch of unassailable security. The empowerment from this subtle shift in living arrangements carried me through the next couple of days as I balanced virtual meetings with the fund's advisory team discussing potential expansions into sustainable forestry ventures that could leverage the cabin's regional ties without drawing attention to my personal stake, all while fielding sporadic texts from Mark that danced around logistics for dividing our shared possessions like the antique clock from his mother or the set of golf clubs, gathering dust in the garage without ever broaching the emotional chasm his departure had carved or acknowledging the role his office dalliance had played in accelerating my isolation. But the real intrusion came unexpectedly one mid-morning when a tentative knock echoed through the hotel door, revealing Jenna standing there in the hallway with an expression blending awkward sympathy and calculated curiosity, as if she had tracked me down through mutual acquaintances in the local business network that connected our overlapping professional worlds, from banking conferences to Chamber of Commerce mixers, where faces like hers popped up as the ambitious up-and-comers eyeing promotions at the expense of veterans like me. She clutched a takeaway coffee cup like a peace offering and launched into an explanation about having heard through the grapevine of my temporary setup and wanting to offer support as a fellow woman navigating the cutthroat dynamics of corporate life, where affairs of The heart often collided messily with career ladders, but beneath her words I detected the ulterior motive as she steered the conversation toward seeking my expertise on personal investing strategies now that she and Mark were contemplating a joint purchase of a starter home in the suburbs to solidify their future amid the rising interest rates squeezing first-time buyers across the nation. Her eyes lighting up with naive enthusiasm for quick return tips on stock picks or real estate flips that betrayed her inexperience in the volatile markets I had navigated solo for years while pretending to be just another cog in the bank machine. Playing along with this unexpected overture required every ounce of my compartmentalized composure as I invited her inside to the small sitting area where the morning light filtered through sheer curtains casting a deceptively warm glow over the scene. And as she settled onto the couch launching into details about their budget constraints and dreams of a backyard for eventual family barbecues, I nodded along dropping carefully curated advice laced with subtle pitfalls like the dangers of over-leveraging on trendy tech stocks that had burned so many during the last correction, or the hidden fees in those too-good-to-be-true property seminars peddled at weekend expos in convention centers from Cleveland to Chicago. All the while infusing my responses with a light humor that masked the sharper intent, such as joking about how chasing the next big thing often left you holding an empty bag, much like misplacing your keys after a late-night celebration, planting seeds of doubt about the stability of her partnership with Mark, whose sales bonuses had always fluctuated more than he admitted, and whose recent choices suggested a pattern of impulsive decisions that could sour their idyllic vision faster than milk left out in the summer heat. She scribbled notes furiously on her phone, oblivious to the undercurrent of my words, which aimed not at outright sabotage, but at a witty erosion of her confidence in the man she had poached from my life. And as she stood to leave with effusive thanks hugging me briefly in a gesture that felt more performative than genuine, I closed the door behind her, suppressing a chuckle at the absurdity of this role reversal where the interloper now sought wisdom from the discarded wife whose hidden acumen could dismantle their facade with a few well-timed nudges through anonymous channels in the investment forums where whispers spread like wildfire among retail traders hungry for an edge. Yet this encounter left me grappling with a fresh dilemma as I paced the room, replaying her visit and weighing the moral tangle of using my knowledge as a tool for indirect revenge when the real target was Mark's betrayal, amplified by the growing suspicion that his influence had extended to my professional downfall, a notion that gained traction later that afternoon when I delved deeper into archived emails from my bank tenure, uncovering a forwarded chain from my ex-boss referencing consultations with external advisors on staff evaluations that suspiciously aligned with the timeline of Mark's complaints about our home stresses bleeding into my work performance, suggesting not just passive gossip, but active orchestration to paint me as unreliable in the eyes of HR during the downsizing wave that had swept through the branch like a cost-cutting tsunami, leaving dozens in my wake, but positioning him to benefit from the optics of a clean break. This discovery sent a surge of conflicted emotions through me, blending outrage at the depth of his duplicity with a strategic thrill at the leverage it provided for the revenges I had begun to envision in quiet moments, staring out at the hotel's manicured lawns that contrasted sharply with the wild, untamed beauty of the cabin waiting as my ultimate refuge. But acting on this evidence now risked escalating the personal war into something public and messy that could expose the fund's operations to scrutiny from regulators, or worse, from those family ties hinted at in Mom's cryptic note, forcing me to pause at the window as dusk fell, wondering if patience would yield a more satisfying unraveling, or if the threads connecting my losses were tightening into a noose that demanded immediate confrontation. Just as my phone buzzed with a message from the lawyer, attaching preliminary findings on the intrusion that pointed fingers in a direction I never anticipated. That message from the lawyer attaching the preliminary findings on the fund's intrusion landed like an unexpected plot twist in one of those legal dramas I used to binge-watch during late-night shifts at the bank, where the characters always uncovered betrayals buried in fine print, much like the digital footprints now tracing back to a freelance investigator with ties to Jenna's extended network through her side gigs in event planning for corporate retreats that often overlapped with the finance circles I navigated discreetly. revealing not a direct assault on my assets, but a probing curiosity driven by her mounting personal debts from lifestyle creep that had her dipping into questionable loans, and now extending feelers for quick financial intel that could either bail her out or expose her to the kind of scrutiny that unraveled lives faster than a house of cards in a stiff breeze across the volatile economic terrain of post-recession America, where middle-class aspirations clashed with realities of stagnant wages and ballooning credit card balances. This connection hit me with a surge of ironic clarity as I scrolled through the attached report in the hotel room's subdued lamplight, feeling the pieces of my personal chaos aligning in ways that mirrored the intricate deal structures I had engineered for the fund's portfolio, including cross-collateralized investments in community solar projects that rewarded patience over panic, much like the strategy one now adopted to counter this threat by instructing the lawyer to fortify the firewalls with additional layers of obfuscation, while I contemplated a non-confrontational countermeasure that would subtly redirect Jenna's desperation back toward her own vulnerabilities without ever surfacing my hand in the matter. Envisioning anonymous posts in online investment forums frequented by her type of ambitious networkers dropping veiled warnings about the pitfalls of partnering with unreliable sources in joint ventures that echoed Mark's own fluctuating reliability in both marriage and career. The weight of this unfolding intrigue pressed even harder when my father's condition took a turn that bridged the personal and the financial in a manner I couldn't ignore any longer. His voicemail arriving the next evening as I returned from a solitary walk through the hotel's adjacent park, where fallen leaves crunched underfoot, reminding me of the seasonal changes back home that once marked family gatherings, now fractured by his earlier dismissal. His voice raspy from post-surgery recovery, detailing complications with the bypass that had extended his hospital stay and ballooned the bills beyond what his Medicare supplement could handle, leaving him in a bind where pride clashed with necessity in that classic blue-collar standoff against the healthcare behemoth that squeezed families from Detroit assembly lines to Ohio steel mills. Listening to him hedge around requests for help while insisting he didn't want to burden anyone stirred a complex brew of resentment and reluctant compassion within me, because this directly invoked the family trust's provisions that Mom had woven with such foresight to cover exactly these contingencies, using the cabin's appreciated value as collateral for low-interest lines of credit that I controlled outright, through irrevocable clauses designed to sidestep Dad's history of impulsive spending on everything from lottery tickets to ill-advised home repairs. And after pacing the room for what felt like hours, weighing the ethics of anonymous intervention against the satisfaction of letting him stew in the consequences of his harsh words, I authorized a transfer through the trust's administrative channels, masked as a routine disbursement from residual estate funds, ensuring coverage for his rehab, therapy, and home modifications without a trace leading back to me, which felt like a layered revenge in itself, a quiet assertion of the power he had overlooked when he barked that they didn't want me around. This act of shadowed benevolence carried a touch of wry humor in its execution, as I imagined the confusion rippling through their household when the relief check arrived without explanation, perhaps prompting my stepmother to speculate about long-lost relatives or lucky insurance windfalls, while Dad grumbled about unseen guardian angels that might just be the daughter he had underestimated amid his tales of bootstraps and hard knocks passed down from his own father's generation of Great Depression survivors who viewed handouts as weakness rather than strategic lifelines. But the real twist amplifying the growing conflicts came from deeper dives into Jenna's digital trail, courtesy of the lawyer's discreet hires, uncovering her embezzlement from a mutual contact, a small business owner in the auto supply chain who had trusted her with bookkeeping for event budgets, only to find discrepancies that paralleled my own hidden savvy in managing off-the-books assets, except hers lacked the ethical scaffolding, leaving her exposed to audits that could cascade into criminal charges, if not nipped with the right pressure points. Seizing this mirror to my own world, I crafted and leaked targeted tips through burner accounts on whistleblower sites, suggesting anonymous reviews of her firm's practices that would alert the contact without implicating me directly, a clever nonviolent unraveling that satisfied the itch for payback by watching from afar as inquiries began piling up on her professional profiles, much like the collection notices she had tried to outrun, infusing the process with a light vulgarity in my private Thoughts about how her so-called upgrade to Mark was now downgrading into a mess that stuck like gum on a hot sidewalk during a summer fair. Yet, just as these threads tightened into a web of impending reckonings promising the regrets I had envisioned, since that shattering Tuesday the universe threw another curveball with Mark appearing unannounced at the hotel lobby the following afternoon, his face etched with the haggard lines of someone whose impulsive choices had caught up faster than anticipated, carrying a folder of divorce papers and a plea in his eyes that demanded I choose between unveiling the full extent of my independence, to watch him crumble under the weight of his misjudgments, or allowing the encircling conflicts to constrict further, drawing him deeper into the snare without a word from me as he approached the front desk asking for my room number in a voice that carried the desperation of a man sensing the ground shifting beneath his feet. Mark's unexpected arrival in the hotel lobby with that folder of divorce papers clutched under his arm like a shield against the storm he had helped brew unfolded in slow motion as I watched from the elevator descending to the ground floor, his posture slouched in a way that betrayed the cracks in his once confident salesman's swagger, now eroded by the fallout from Jenna's spiraling debts and the whispers of her professional missteps that my anonymous leaks had amplified through the interconnected grapevines of business referrals and online review sites, where reputations crumbled faster than overbaked cookies at a neighborhood bake sale. And as he spotted me stepping out, his eyes locked onto mine with a mixture of hope and hesitation that pulled me into a quiet corner booth at the lobby's coffee bar, where the aroma of fresh brews did little to mask the bitterness of the conversation about to ensue, forcing me to navigate the delicate balance between revealing just enough of my hidden resilience to sting without unleashing the full torrent of the fund's success, or the cabin sanctuary that could have rewritten our shared history if pride hadn't kept me silent through the years of marital drift. Sitting across from him as he slid the documents over, explaining the terms with a voice laced with regret about how things had moved too fast with Jenna, whose charm had blinded him to the red flags of her financial recklessness, now manifesting in bounced checks and tense arguments over unpaid bills that echoed the very stresses he had once blamed on our stable but unexciting routine. I listened with a composed exterior while internally chuckling at the poetic justice of his predicament, picturing how the man who had traded me in for a flashier model was now stuck with a lemon that soured every drive toward their supposed fresh start, much like those impulse buys at infomercials that promised transformation but delivered headaches and buyer's remorse in equal measure. And in response, I countered with measured candor, admitting to a consulting side hustle that had kept me afloat through the chaos, without delving into the specifics of the private equity fund's robust returns from ventures in renewable infrastructure that aligned with national pushes for energy independence amid geopolitical tensions roiling global markets. This partial disclosure served as my first layer of revenge, a witty undercutting of his assumptions about my vulnerability by letting him glimpse the independence he had overlooked during our 18 years together, where I had juggled bank hours with clandestine deal-making that built a nest egg substantial enough to weather any storm, including the one he had unleashed with his affair and possible meddling in my layoff, prompting him to lean in with apologies tumbling out about regretting the haste of his choices and the pain he had caused, in a way that almost elicited sympathy, if not for the fresh sting of betrayal still lingering like a bad aftertaste from cheap wine at a forced reconciliation dinner. But instead of forgiving outright, I steered the discussion toward equitable asset division, insisting on a clean break that favored neither party, knowing full well my concealed assets positioned me to emerge unscathed, while his entanglements with Jenna's debts would drag him through legal quagmires of joint liabilities that courts in family-friendly Ohio often scrutinized harshly for couples entangled in extramarital entanglements. As he signed the preliminary agreement with a hand that trembled slightly, promising to handle the details swiftly and perhaps even reach out once the dust settled, I felt a surge of detached satisfaction, watching him leave the lobby with shoulders rounded against the weight of impending realities that my subtle interventions had hastened, from the fund's fortified defenses repelling further probes to the ripple effects on Jenna's career, now teetering on the brink of collapse as her embezzlement came under formal review courtesy of those tipped-off contacts who had once viewed her as a rising star in the event planning scene, only to discover the discrepancies that mirrored the hidden savvy I wielded ethically. Shifting focus to my father brought the emotional core of the reckonings to a head as I drove back to Akron a few days later under skies heavy with the promise of winter snow that blanketed the highways in a hush reminiscent of the quiet enforcements I had enacted through the trust covering his escalating medical costs from rehab sessions to adaptive equipment that transformed his ranch house into a space of cautious recovery without ever crediting the source beyond vague notions of maternal legacy watching over from afar. And during a visit to his bedside where the room smelled of antiseptic and faint traces of his favorite aftershave, I finally unveiled the truth over a shared plate of hospital cafeteria meatloaf that tasted surprisingly like home-cooked comfort amid the beeps of monitors tracking his progress, explaining how the trust under my stewardship had been the invisible hand pulling him from the financial brink, a revelation that crumpled his features into a mask of profound remorse as he grasped my hand, murmuring admissions of foolishness in pushing away the daughter whose strength he had dismissed in favor of outdated notions of self-reliance forged in the forges of his factory days, where vulnerability equated to weakness in the macho code of Midwestern patriarchs. This humbling exchange wove threads of partial reconciliation through the fabric of our strained bond as he shared stories of Mom's quiet determinations that I had inherited, unknowingly fueling tears that washed away some of the resentment built from his barked rejection, yet leaving behind the indelible regret that would shadow his remaining years like the cabin's looming peaks over the valleys below, where I soon retreated after finalizing the house sale for a profit that bolstered the fund without fanfare. Nestled in the Colorado cabin with its wooden beams creaking softly under fresh snowfall and views stretching across snow-capped ranges that invited introspection on the cost of secrets, kept too long I thrived in the solitude, channeling energies into mentoring sessions via video calls with women in finance, navigating similar crossroads of underappreciation and corporate glass ceilings, sharing anonymized tales of resilience that inspired without exposing the full saga of my triumphs, from the fund's expansions into climate-resilient agriculture to the personal rebirth symbolized by this mountain haven. But as evenings drew in with mugs of herbal tea warming my hands against the chill, I found doubts creeping in like fog rolling down the slopes, questioning whether my silences and calculated revenges had truly healed the fractures from Mark's departure and Dad's dismissal, or merely buried them under layers of financial armor that isolated me further from the messy authenticity of human connections in a nation where second chances often came wrapped in therapy bills and self-help podcasts promising closure amid the grind of daily survival. Mark's occasional voicemails piled up with overtures of friendship tinged with unspoken longing, while Dad's letters arrived warm with invitations to visit, bearing the weight of his transformed perspective. Yet, as I gazed into the starlit void from the porch, wondering if their regrets would ever bridge the chasm, or if my path of quiet power had forever altered the woman who once sought validation in the ordinary ties of family and marriage, the ambiguity lingered like an unanswered echo, prompting reflections on whether true victory lay in outlasting the pain or in the courage to voice the truths that might have spared us all the long winding road to this contemplative peace.